now the dynamic. Now we are going to listen to the background of Socrates' speeches on divination in Xenophon's Memorabilia.
Great. Well, thank you. So I belatedly uploaded a handout to the shared drive, which is titled "More Handout," following the formal procedures. So this is going to be very casual, both because of the nature of the thing and also because I still feel quite motion sick from the many airplanes. So and also by the nature of the thing, I mean that I am quite drawn basically to a series of similarities, and I have some. No, is something going wrong? No. Okay. It's a series of similarities that are concerning divination in sets of arguments about the gods in the 5th century. So the idea with the background is so I'm especially taken by this speech of Theseus's in the Suppliant Women, where Theseus is doing a lot of is giving a complicated speech, most of which is quite irrelevant, so I claim, to Adrastus, where he ends up claiming that divination is a possibility, it's an actuality, it's a good that humans receive from the gods, and Adrastus should appreciate divination in a better way than he has. Certain consequences follow from that. What's interesting to me about this speech is that we have many elements which do not concern divination directly and do not then concern the point of the speech, which is that Adrastus needs to pay closer attention to the relevance of divination. Now, the reason this is interesting to me in the present context is that, so I claim in the two conversations that Socrates has in the Memorabilia on the topic of the gods, that's in 1.4 and 4.3, we get quite complex, you might think of it as the physico-theological argument, a kind of teleological argument, argument about, about the existence of the gods and their beneficence. These arguments end up talking about divination at the end in a what you might think of in a kind of climactic way. Certainly for the conversation with Aristodemus, it is definitely climactic because one of the things, the primary thing that Aristodemus was doing wrong was not accepting the reality of divination and even ridiculing people who were diviners. So I was taken by the fact that both of these arguments end up by talking about divination, not always observed in such a direct way in scholarship, though not always ignored. We have that argument in the Suppliant Women, but we have a very similar argument as well in the Prometheus Bound, where Prometheus's self-expression about the goods he gives to the humans effectively ends with 16 lines about divination. So you have that. So you have then similar arguments in the clouds, so I claim, also so in the birds, so I claim. So anyway, the point of the paper is to make this observation and then to offer up at least some possible explanations about maybe it doesn't offer a possible explanation. Anyway, it points to the importance of looking for possible explanations about the way that we have what look to me to be these kinds of argument packages, groups of considerations that end up with divination that will often go through claims about the existence of gods on the basis of all kinds of naturalistic considerations. So one thing to be thinking about is that in the 5th century, it may be that arguments about the existence or non-existence of the gods are occasioned by questions of divination. And that what we see in Xenophon's two Socratic arguments or conversations are versions of that kind of argumentation, arguments for divination that then end up depending on a lot of other considerations that would have been tried out in various forms, sometimes in cultural catalog form, sometimes in naturalistic explanation form, and so on. So I'll just finish to say that so the upshot for Xenophon and Socrates studies, rather than just for 5th century studies of theological reasoning, is that often we'll say, well, we have Xenophon presenting Socrates doing this thing for the first time. And I want to say instead, there is a culture of talking about these kinds of issues, many very similar arguments coming from around 420, which have seemed to be around the dramatic date of these arguments. And it would be important to think about them together. Now, I won't go any further with more specific speculations or sharper theses than that, but this is what's going on.
Yeah, I probably just gonna give you a way of rephrasing your main thesis, but maybe weigh in on the debate about the originality of the ideas in more worth reading. Memorabilia, right? There's a lot of things debate about whether from Socrates, about it's made up, but I think it's your view is that it was kind of in the air as it were, philosophy or how would you?
Yeah, that's great.
How much is new in those chapters?
Right. So I would say that I think that the structure of the overall structure of both of those arguments was already in the air in 420. Now, the two I'll call overall arguments in 1.4 and 4.3 contain very many details for which we don't have exact comparison cases. So there's a lot more material. Now I can't say, I'm not ready to say Xenophon came up with all those arguments because there's going to be a lot of material from the 5th century, late 5th century, early 4th century, little less early 4th century, that we have now lost. So it strikes me that what we've got is the most complex, I mean, in both 1.4 and 4.3, the most complex versions of those arguments from the time. But I don't see that we can then say that the idea or the purpose, or as it were, the overall point is new with Xenophon. Yeah, I'll stop it. Wait.
Oh, sorry. So it's fun following your career. I want to ask about the impact of your work on the software volume. Did that have any effect on the current project that you're working on?
Yeah.
Are there your interest in this topic in any way grow out of the work you did with Josh doing the software?
Yes.
Okay. Could you talk about how the software volume and your work with Josh and that leads to current this topic?
I mostly don't want to, but I will say something. I'll try to say something to the point. Yes, to the point. So I'm interested out of the context of the Cambridge Companion to the Sophist to thinking about intellectual practice in a way that's rather less siloed than is typical among, let me at least say, Plato scholars, where there's philosophers and there's sophists. And that strikes me as a goofy thing to do, but whatever, it happens when you're caught in the 4th century and not looking at historical context. So in that respect, I want to be able to say, sure, who are interesting writers at this time in the late 5th century, who are writing about what end up being sort of the abstracta that then get discussed in rather more continuous and purified ways in the 4th century. So Euripides, Aristophanes, Pseudo-Aeschylus, and so forth. And so from that from that perspective, so the Cambridge Companion of the Sophist is not really a companion to the five guys who are traditionally called the Sophists, but to those who are intellectuals at the time. And I think by thinking of intellectuals as such, where we don't then have a built-in either a value hierarchy or an assumption that some people are just teaching or an assumption that some people are being tricky, then we're able to see these continuities of argument structure. So.
Which ends with the question of divination. The representation of study field.
Yeah.
And it ends the conclusion about divination also.
Yeah, that's good. Yes, and so, I mean, you would know this better. I'm not much of a student of the Stoics, but what I understand is this paper, by Nate Powers, who wrote it while he was doing a dissertation on the Stoics about either 1.4 or 4.3. And he was describing the degree to which the Stoics turned specifically to those two, either one or the other, Xenophon passage, as very influential, at least to structure their own way of arguing. So I appreciate that. Oh yes, you said you were also going to ask a question. Yes. Right. Why? Yes. I don't develop it there. That's right. That's right. So in both 1.4 and 4.3, but let's just stick with 4.3. The argument is that Socrates teaches sophrosune before ta politika, right? And so we're going to get an example, or so Xenophon wants to show that that is so. And so then to show that, in fact, Socrates teaches sophrosune evidently in a relevant way, which I would have thought in a relevant way means with respect to the things that matter in political life. The way that then that Xenophon shows that is, well, he teaches sophrosune peritheos, and here is a way in which, and here's an instance of the way that he does so. Now, I can see the chain of reasoning because sophrosune and eusebeia are overlapping terms for Xenophon. I could also see that it is possible that one of the criticisms of Socrates was that he taught Alcibiades and Critias to disregard divination. But he's not saying that, but Xenophon doesn't take that line very expressly, very explicitly. So I think one would not expect a justification of Socrates' teaching of sophrosune that he convinces Euthydemus that he should engage, that he convinces Aristodemus that he should engage in divinatory practices or not make fun of other diviners, or of Euthydemus that he should participate regularly in the civic religious rituals.
What do you think about the fact that in 1.4 and 4.3,
Yep.
you have the same sequence? In 1.4 is about piety.
Yep.
1.5 and krateia. And you have the same in 4.3 and 4.4 the justice of yes, but the educational training of Euthydemus begins in 4.3 about that's the question about the gods. Right.
Right, and then sophrosune about the people is justice.
Completely. I think Socrates always starting about the piety and comparing with the name in both.
Right. Yes, so just very briefly, I think it's because I think that in other cases, Xenophon has a broader conception of sophrosune than piety. And so so I accept that it is not, in the end, irrational. It is, one can reconstruct it to work. It just strikes me that it is not what one would expect. If one thought like, goddamn Socrates, he's just teaching people dialectical skill. And so then Critias and Alcibiades go run off with it. I want to see that he can like teach them to control, not just control them, but that they can see like what matters, they can pursue what matters. And then instead we get this natural theological argument. And we get it a second time. It just seems like it's not, if what we wanted to see was that Socrates teaches people to appreciate the gods in the right way, we could have just said so. We didn't need to build into the structure of sophrosune preceding ta politica. And so that's why I think that, it's irrelevant, but I think that Xenophon thought these arguments were so cool. He thought they were associated with Socrates in some way that we don't need to dispute right now. And he needed a place to put it, because in otherwise, I think the structure of the memorabilia, maybe it was not totally obvious how he would fit them in. And using the reasoning that you just suggested, that was as good a place as any. Oh.
I have actually one suggestion, like text that perhaps how to like improve your arguments. Perhaps texts that are perhaps even better than the memorabilia 1.4.
Whoa.
Memorabilia 1.6, like completes less pilot, beginning and end with divination and the importance of something like God. Also, in the particles, as well, it begins and ends on the importance of divination and consulting their God. And in both that, they end with a sort of like skeptical view on like, yeah, you may be an expert in divination, but the gods may choose not to answer, they may not be willing to help. So it's kind of like skeptical view. And so that's, and my question is, at some point in your text, you use the expression, the promise of divination, something like that. So sort of like Xenophon's main theological issue would not be like atheism or even the God's philanthropy, but the promise of divination. What do you mean by the promise of divination? It's like, is Xenophon questioning the effectiveness of divination, or even the possibility of divination? So your thoughts on
Okay, so let me start with the first part. So I'm not the first part, the suggestion about texts. So do you think that these texts are ones where, in addition to talk about divination, it's bringing in a bunch of stuff which looks relevant but is not actually relevant? Because that's what I'm trying to show. I'm trying to show that there's many different ways to defend divination.
Sure.
And we see a couple of those ways in the Socratic conversation with Aristodemus. In the Theseus argument, there's no explicit defense of divination, except that it is one of like these 9 things that the one God among the others provides. So it's a kind of it's a strange kind of argument. It's a kind of you build up momentum sort of argument. And so that's the kind of evidence that's important for me to see that it's not that we're talking about divination. It's clear through the 5th and 4th century, the issue of divination is huge. And a lot of people believe it. A lot of people are skeptical about it. And there's lots of questions. What I want to show is that there's like this vestigial stuff. There's this extra stuff that is sometimes brought along with a claim about divination. And then we can draw some conclusions about what's going on when, like to say, is Theseus really interested in exploring the existence of the gods? No. He's not interested in that. He's interested in claiming about divination. So then to just answer your question very, very briefly. Yeah, my interest, my thought is that Xenophon is not interested in the existence of gods. He thinks it's obvious. And even about the benevolence. He is interested in showing or in explaining or asserting or valorizing divination. So I don't think he's skeptical. I think, but he's aware, but he's deeply aware of skepticism. I mean, he includes Aristodemus and Eusebius in his thought.
Thank you very much. Emily, women, political, eco-feminist, and post-human lens.
Thank you so much. And just to join the chorus of thanks to the organizers. I mean, what a magnificent start this conference has gotten off to already. Just amazing. So in the text I shared, I pointed to a few modern approaches that I think can help us appreciate Xenophon's achievement in approaching women and getting past the old misogyny, seeing women as part of a broader ecosystem created by beneficent deities. And I do think that it's important to Xenophon that these gods are, have created the world in this way. And I'll briefly comment on those, and then I want to get to justice, because it strikes me, I said nothing much about justice and what I shared, but this is really what it comes down to for Xenophon. So first of all, intersectionality. Xenophon's thought is profoundly intersectional. We see it in how in his narrative history of the 4th century in Hellenica, in his depiction of the entitlement mindset, as I call it, that hegemons have, how he exposes interactions between different systems of power and oppression, connections between the various axes of subordination, and the negative societal ramifications those have, most obvious in the episode of Kinodome. But I think the silence of women, in fact, women do not appear in that work as wise advisors, or almost never as expressive. Ecofeminist perspectives relate the oppression of women not only to the oppression of other groups, but also to ways of being in the broader environment. Disparaging attitudes towards women connect with those towards the natural world. And I think this is implicit in Xenophon's depiction of Pharnabastus as a man unusually appreciative, both of female capacity, in my very favorite narrative of all, the one of Mania, talking about that with someone earlier today, and of his paradises full of trees and wild animals, which the Spartans have destroyed, destroying the beautiful environment of this man who, right at the beginning of the Hellenica, we've been hearing about, you have Pharnabastus out there in the sea on his horse, helping the Spartans. We remember this, I think, later on. And finally, material eco-criticism, ecofeminism, and more broadly post-humanism offer frameworks that help illuminate Xenophon's understanding of women's value and place. Since for him, humans and non-human animals and things, and we've been hearing about dogs in particular today, exist within a broader category of life, all of it part of the cosmos, one that he, countering the pessimistic views of archaic poetry, takes to have been designed and created by beneficent deities. And as I outlined just very briefly in the paper I shared, he reveals intersections and connections between humans and gods, human and non-human animals, or men and women. Human beings at their best share affinities with the divine, as when they govern in exemplary fashion or delight in being honored. Conversely, assumptions of human exceptionalism are put to the test by his anthropomorphizing approach to animals. And I talked a bit about that, but we've heard enough about, I think, the dogs and well, how even wild animals less intelligent than human beings can display wisdom. It's a really interesting thing in Hippocrates. And animals in the natural world in general hold lessons for human beings. Nature itself can model exemplary conduct, just conduct. But it occurred to me as I was thinking about this over the last day or so, that this all stems from his overriding concern with justice. All these approaches I'm talking about emerge from a sense of the undue, narrow, hierarchizing, privileging of the human, usually the male human, at the expense of women, the environment, and more. And justice emerged as a key theme of the monograph I've been working on the topic of Xenophon's women. We all know he's drawn to and invested in questions of justice, where in Plato's account, the Delphic oracle celebrated Socrates as most wise of all men. Xenophon Socrates recounts how, in the presence of many, Apollo answered that no one was more free than I, or more just, or more disciplined. Justice for Xenophon and for Socrates is the supreme virtue in human relationships. It's the equivalent of piety in relation to the gods. And given the Socratic's interest in probing the possibility of virtue being the same in men and women, it's perhaps not surprising that Xenophon and for Socrates put serious consideration into women, their role, and implicitly the morality of the inequality based on sex that was by and large taken for granted in ancient Greece. Xenophon broaches the issue of justice and gender most explicitly when Mania puts the question to Pharnabasdus, if I serve you no worse than him, why should you appoint another, a man, as satrap? And what you see in the narrative that follows is the overturning of Pharnabasdus's initial assumptions about women's inferiority. She's better than all the others. And in other ways, too, I think Ximena can weld the issue of gender onto the issue of social inequality, with the motives ascribed to Spartans and their kings laying bare the gulf between their rhetoric of justice and the reality of their drive for power, a form of justice implicitly connected to social injustices at home. And that's where we see, I think, Xenophon expressly eliding traditions of Spartan female authority. And I've mentioned the ecological dimension that is there as well. And perhaps, yeah, how much time do I have? No, I think let me leave it there. I just want to come back to the question of justice.
So,
Is that, I never remember the numbers, but was that the one with the mother? No, Aristarchus.
it is.
It's the mother. Well, that is, along with Mania, it's my favorite passage in all of Xenophon, of course, as a mother myself. It's nice having I think it's remarkable. The mother there, I agree with Tetsuko van Berkel, the mother there is the archetypal philos. And she's actually modeling something that goes beyond mere xenophontic reciprocal philia, where, you're giving back what someone's given you, because as Tetsuko nicely puts it, what the mother does, it's a shot in the dark. She's doing all this stuff for her infants with no way of knowing whether this will be reciprocated. And indeed, in the scenario where you've got Socrates trying to persuade his very ungrateful son Lampocles, completely ungrateful, unaware of all the good that his mother's done him. So the whole scenario is underscoring the fact that all her hard work has not been, he's not caring for it. So yeah.
I mean, I think just to follow up, it's that in addition to looking at it as an illustration of philia, as you just said, that I would suggest to you that it's a good illustration of justice. In other words, that embedded in the structure of the second book, as you just pointed out, you've got all of these examples why you should do a nice thing to a person because then they'll invite you to it. And again, you get all of these.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that it comes down to justice.
It's justice.
And Xenophon says this in Cyropaedia. He says, the Persians, it's very nice how they actually formalize this idea that, you should be returning good deeds. Whereas the Greek cities, they care if there's an injustices of other sorts get punished, but not this kind of, not this sort of interpersonal.
But to put it in a more Catholic way, even the women, even the Persians realize that they can do a good deed so that they can get a good deed back, whereas Socrates' wife does a good deed without any expectation of getting anything.
That's just what I was saying.
Right thing to do. It's practicality.
follow-up?
Yeah, so it's been very nice to sort of see your book grow, and in this latest installment.
Over a
we'll
long
sort of be-
time.
Yeah, we'll sort
It's
of,
like a child.
yeah, I mean, but now, and a shot in the dark, but now sort of the theory came in, the ecofeminism, which I really sort of enjoyed, but I wondered, is it in the end, you presented as sort of mostly heuristic, but in the end, I
Yeah.
feel you are also in a sense making claims for Xenophon as almost a proto, or how will this emerge in your book, so to speak?
Yeah, well, this is the last, because the book, basically the manuscript's finished. Some of you in this room have very kindly read the whole thing. But yes, it's just in this process of finalizing it. My sense is that it's more heuristic. It's more about saying, you know, Xenophon really can contribute to these conversations right now. And I mean, other authors too, other ancient authors can as well. But that he speaks to this moment in some very interesting ways. And I think this is why it's interesting to me to just juxtapose or bring in some modern theory. Because I think he's not being, he's not being put into this conversation. But I think he has much to provide. And it goes against some really problematic, I don't know, MAGA views of antiquity, for instance.
Okay, no,
Some of his sensibilities.
Yeah. More.
Okay, we have time for 2 questions. I think.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting, and I can see that you have a lot of translation. I feel like a little bit like your views are getting more radical than mine on the way Xenophon is presenting his theories, like in a very nice way, like in a radical compared to what's the usual mainstream views or what's happening. So you tell me, now we're like. I wanted to ask, since you very touched on your presentation on the technological part, what do you think about Cyrus gardening in TikTok?
Yeah, well, it's just a really interesting moment there. When in this Socratic work based in Athens, that Xenophon, has Ischomachus invoke Cyrus and his gardens, and to my mind, it's a piece with this very just this broad perspective that he has that sees value, all over the show, and they're taking the time in that work to appreciate. Yes, Cyrus's Cyrus the gardener, not just Cyrus the war leader. So I think that's really interesting and important. And there are ways in which, and others have brought this out, ways in which the wife, including Sarah Pomeroy, the wife and the king, readers are invited to compare the wife of Ischomachus with the Persian king. And this is just it's sort of exploding some, some sort of binaries I think some of his readers might have in their minds. I think it's a very bold and interesting move, is what I'd say.
I don't remember, but it's like gardening also prepares all for the other virtues, including war virtues, and help right, very so.
Yeah, to see a reader interested in that. It's lovely that Xenophon offers us that picture. Thank you.
Very much.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that Xenophon questions the framework of women on that. But in what framework does as far as I observe, very often it's a kind of utilitarian aim that he is providing. So we have this passage in the very first paper this morning. So he talks about this minister, I think was the name, who is winning the race because he has ridden the horses. And then he says, yeah, you can achieve it without any manly virtue, so to say, but with valor. And if you look at many other passages where women are mentioned, it's exactly about this. How can we, for instance, improve the household, bring more revenues into the household? And other passages, how can we run a government very well? So is it, to phrase it in a very hard way, is it just a capitalistic view?
Well,
You just employ women, horses, whatever alike to make the best out of it for your system.
Yeah, I mean, I would frame it much more positively than that. But Xenophon, I very much appreciate the fact that he thinks about the basics, like how to get food on the table, how to, it's not all philosophy up in the sky. It's thinking about bodies. It's thinking about, Aristarchus's household, which is poverty stricken and needs to find ways of making money. So yes, absolutely. And I would argue strongly against the idea that Xenophon looks down on, making money. I think he appreciates this. Look at Poroi. He's very interested in helping Athens do precisely this, but I don't think it stands in. He's also interested in ways in which, like an economicus, the picture of the household ends up mirroring what it is that the gods want us to be doing. So it's sort of it's not that the fact that there's an emphasis on function and utility and all of this, that doesn't have to be opposed to the notion of thinking about morality and thinking about piety. I would say no, it's the reverse. It's that what we're doing here has the stamp of approval of the gods. We're doing what the gods want us to be doing, and it's like an act of piety. Yes.
We have time for one short question, and you.
I wanted to ask you about women at war, and especially in the Anabasis, because there's a point in book 6, I think, where there's a symposium and there are all these dances and they're all with weapons. And the Pelasgian, I think it's a Pelasgian, is stupefied that even when there's a woman who's dancing, she dances with a weapon. And Xenophon and his followers respond by saying it was actually the women who drove the king out of our camp in the battle of Cunaxa. And at that point in book 1, the only use of Sophia, I think, is used in the Anabasis to describe the Milesian woman. So sort of curious how women at war would fit into your picture of,
Yeah, well, I mean, from one perspective, compared with Herodotus, say, there's a dearth of women. There are not so many women involved. I mean, yeah, among the non-combatants and things. And yet he finds ways to bring them in, and very interesting, like when there are women, he makes the most of them, including with how As came up earlier today. And he totally does exactly what she tells him to do. And it's thanks to her at the end of Anabasis that he ends up with enough money to kind of re-enter the Charis economy of being able to do something for a friend again. I mean, the dancing girl, who performs the Pyrrhic dance amazingly well. And then there's this wonderful joke that they have. Oh, yes, it was the women who. So I think there's a joke there, but there's a serious purchase as well, because a treaty follows because they've made enough of an impact on the other party.
It's true, it is a joke, but it is also true that the women drive the king, they scare the king away when they flee from their tent, right? And they go to the soldiers in the baggage train and alert them to the king's presence, right? So it is, I think, intended as a joke in one sense, but I think it's serious.
But there's also some, and I think every time you find a woman mentioned in war, there's always some serious aspect. But anyway, I talked too much. Thank you for your patience. Not that I was way over.
How does it affect your view of the expression? If you want to, that promises are quite dark, if they are, because they were not kind of virtue. How does that affect the view?
Yes, well, actually, yes. And I think, I mean, my own sense here is that Xenophon expected his audience to be aware of this sort of extra-textual, future reality of these characters. Yeah, I mean, I would argue that it sort of strengthens some of the themes of the dialogue, and that Callias fails to be the kind of husband that he ought to be to create a good household. Callias, you know, blue-blooded Callias, dilettante, completely oblivious of the importance of or the the responsibilities and the functions and the roles of the women that he's involved with. I think that it shows what a failure Callias was, and it's kind of showing again. I mean, Ascomachus, according to the dialogue, while Ascomachus is there, he's attentive to his wife, he listens to her, they actually have conversation, unlike Critobulus and his wife. He says he never, scarcely ever talks with her. So I would see the future reality is kind of driving home what happens, the risks you run if you don't care about the women, if you just kick up your heels and act like a Callias. This is the kind of future. Obviously, it's very speculative. Dave has a wonderful book that takes it in a different direction. But yeah, that's how. So I would compare it maybe with some of those other moments where Xenophon, like at the end of the Spartan Constitution or at the end of the Syracuside, he doesn't shy away from confronting sort of hard realities that challenge the ideals of a picture he's drawn, or suggest that the challenge of sustaining that kind of ideal over time. And very speculative, but I've indicated how I think it can sustain a reading according to which you should care about the women.
So, thank you very much. But now we're going to listen to the second prince with Xenophon and the performance of Socratic theory and the symposium.
Thank you. And thanks again to everybody for organizing it. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. And I apologize for disrupting the program because we should be hearing about dogs at this juncture. And we should have heard from me with the protreptics and the side audiences, which I think both of which topics fit well into this paper, and I would inflate them in a future version. So this paper examines 4 passages in Xenophon's Symposium, where the bantering activity depicted in the scene, a mode of performance easy to overlook as mere framework to the circuit of speeches, and to the climactic final performance of the Syracusan dance troupe, and also the other performances that they do, and Socrates singing and dancing and what have you. This is yet another mode of performance, is bantering about philosophy on the sidelines, appears to allude knowingly to Socrates' quest to construct inductive accounts and find universals. The intimations of technical Socratic dialectic and pursuit of definition that appear in Xenophon's Socratic works, especially the Memorabilia, have generally been understood by scholars since the early 20th century as Xenophon's dim understanding of and selective uses of Plato's early, middle, and late dialogues, with which he mixed freely while ignoring completely the theory of forms and the many serious topics that Plato's texts have taken together were about, including the Symposium. Here we seek to, well, that's a whole, never mind about that, because he does address that arguably. Here we seek to lay groundwork for a different explanation of Xenophon's knowledge of Socrates' technical practices to restore Xenophon to his former responsibility for presenting his own memory of the historical Socrates in combination with accounts of Socraticism offered by a range of literary Socratic disciples, surely including Plato, but also including Antisthenes and maybe Hermogenes. And he may even feature Hermogenes and Antisthenes in the Symposium for purposes of deflecting Plato's views on the ontology of virtue. That's out on a limb a little bit, but I would like to be able to argue that. These characters appear as 2 of the 4 companions of Socrates in Xenophon's Symposium, and are there portrayed as his most advanced, if also far from perfected, disciples. For this question of how the Symposium reflects what we might with Aristotle consider Socrates' contribution to philosophical theory, the pursuit of inductive accounts, and the quest for universals. It's not the major speeches on valuable assets delivered by these two characters or any of the four Socratics, or well, Socrates' main speech is actually one of these passages, so that's not exactly side banter, but we'll come back to that. That create the impression that they share in a peculiarly Socratic interest in inductive accounts, the essence of virtue or universals in their definitions, but their participation in the other kinds of activity, that is the banter, cross-examining discussion, and silence, performed outside the cycle of speeches as part of the overall fun of the symposium. So the first of the passages that I consider in the paper is discussion of the bravery of the female acrobat in the Syracusan dance, one of his dance disciples, where Socrates says to Antisthenes, people who see how bravely the lady jumps through the flaming hoops will not, or the hoops with swords, I think it is, will not still gainsay that virtue, that courage, manliness, etymologically can be taught when they see this young lady jumping through the dance hoops. So in the paper, I first build up the possibility that Antisthenes wrote a text called the Protreptics that could be another background text to the symposium literature, maybe activated more by Xenophon than by Plato. But one of my purposes in the first version of this paper that I wrote was to try to challenge or bust open this longstanding conflict over whether Xenophon wrote first or Plato wrote first, and there could be a third text in this picture which might explain some things. It's not necessarily, we don't have to explain them as a self-contained duo. So we have fragments about drinking vessels attributed to Antisthenes' Protreptics, in which Socrates is a speaker. And all this is detailed in the paper. I won't go through it all in detail, but Antisthenes also wrote a text on bravery, courage, and justice that's called the Protreptics, and there's a subtitle on Theognis. Theognis is a quotation from Theognis is brought up in the same area of Xenophon in chapter 2 of the Symposium as a place where we can learn virtue, and arguably when Socrates says to Antisthenes, no one will still gainsay, he's activating the famous thesis of Antisthenes that is documented as famous because both Aristotle and Diogenes Laertius tell us it was his famous thesis. It is not possible to gainsay. And arguably Socrates and Antisthenes are knowingly playing philosophy between themselves for the purpose of, initially I was writing thinking the purpose of the reader's appreciation that philosophy also happens in this mix of seriousness and fun at the symposium. But maybe in light of papers I heard today, maybe it's for the purpose of the non-Socratic audience at the symposium. Philip does intrude in the argument about, yeah, we should hire this guy to teach the Athenians bravery. But Callias and Niceratus and Lycon and Autolycus, maybe the non-Socratics of the most interest in this text, don't ever intervene in these philosophical side conversations. So that's the first of the four passages, and I'm just summarizing here. The second passage is where Callias in 3:4 has been asked what is the asset of which he is the most proud. So Socrates deflects the party at the end of chapter 2 back to Callias's initial invitation to the Socratics, which was that he had some virtue, some knowledge of which he was proud that he'd never shown off before. And so Socrates invites Callias to now tell us what is that knowledge of which you're most proud. And the phrasing of exactly what each partygoer is supposed to say in their great cycle of speeches changes a lot, but the initial request is to make people better. So Callias says he makes people better, that he makes people better. That's what he can do well. And Antisthenes immediately confronts him by asking him whether this is through teaching a craft or virtue, kalokagothia. Callias agrees to the latter if kalokagothia is justice, actually, is what he says there. And Antisthenes replies with an agreement that this is indisputable since courage and wisdom on occasions can be harmful to both friends and the city, can seem to be, but justice is not even in one respect mixed with injustice. Now, Huss, following Potzer, says this is untrue of the historic Antisthenes, and I think that it, and the argument is that it's distilled Plato, and I won't go into all the technicalities here because of lack of time, but they're laid out in the paper. And I find parallels elsewhere in Antisthenes to propose that it is what Antisthenes thought, and that the theory of forms is sort of implicated in this criterion of unmixed, if we compare passages in the Phaedo and the Republic, and that Antisthenes doesn't, there's a big story about him objecting to Plato's theory of forms, and he accepts some of the Socratic commitments to virtues without Plato's forms, but he goes very close, and that's what Xenophon likes. That's as far as Xenophon will go in committing to the theory of forms. But Xenophon doesn't just fail to include or understand or I guess the proposal is he never understands Plato's theory of forms, but they're never there. And I'm trying to claim in this passage in particular that they're knowingly not there, and that's why he likes Antisthenes, and that's why he has Antisthenes as a speaker at the symposium. The third passage is yeah, we're over time. So the third passage is part of Socrates' discussion of the task of the master class, and the fourth is from Hermogenes' reluctance to be able to define what drunkenness is, but he says he can start from what seems to him, and in both of those cases, I think there's some serious philosophy there that's not. Thank you.
Time for some questions.
I've got two questions. First of all, is there any text that comes down to it from antiquity that makes a better case for its author's determination to respond to Antisthenes and Xenophon's symposium?
No.
And my second question is, since as you know, we disagree on the question of knowledge of the symposium, is how do you explain that the decisive importance of Antisthenes and Xenophon's symposium, as opposed to this comparative, if not total, absence from Plato's symposium? So we find Antisthenes in Plato's symposium, and I don't see an A in Plato responding to him on the theory of forms or something like that. But don't you think that an argument could be made that Xenophon's symposium inspired Plato precisely because Xenophon's symposium is responding so acutely to Antisthenes, whereas Plato's symposium is ignoring them?
So I agree that Antisthenes is not to be found in Plato's symposium. Oh, that's not true. When they talk about praising salt and stuff at the beginning, I think that could be, that could be related. It's when they're getting around to Eros as their topic.
Right.
In the banter before. So possibly there, because the narrow drinking vessel is part of what he might be moving on from. He could be, well, maybe Antisthenes' parallel text didn't go into Eros properly at all. Eros, I mean, Antisthenes gets teased by Socrates in Xenophon's symposium for being in love with no one. We get that whole thing. So that could be, but I think that the symposium of Plato does not need Antisthenes at all. I agree. So the question is, why could Xenophon not be first in using Antisthenes, then Plato writes it out? It could be, oh, was that your question? I mean, we could have had Antisthenes and then Xenophon and then Plato, which is how you want it, right? Except I think Xenophon's got to be responding to Plato too. So I would say Antisthenes, Plato, and then Xenophon pulls Antisthenes out of the drawer to write a different symposium.
Well, I'm just trying.
And also he,
Settle the question, like, what's it?
no, I want Antisthenes to be, I want his presence in Xenophon to be explained a little better than anyone ever pays attention to.
No, I get that. But the fact that it is, I like, I mean, he's clearly, and I think there are other passages like in the Ion, like we can, I follow you with finding Antisthenes, but this seems to, I just want.
And then I just get exasperated by this whole story, even by Andreas Patzar, whose dissertation was on Antisthenes. He then writes these articles that completely deny that Antisthenes had anything interesting philosophically to say, and everything attributed to him, especially this passage, put in his mouth by Xenophon. No, that can't be true of historical Antisthenes. That's probably Plato. So why would you put Plato's words in Antisthenes' mouth?
He's ugly on Xenophon,
Well, his dissertation on Antisthenes was good, but.
yeah, okay. I think that, thanks.
Any other questions?
However, I love what you're doing by broadening the kind of normal, or at least normal to me, and I do more than this, we kind of foil for Socrates. So we kind of look at Paul and for human people and cranky. You're finding this philosophical stuff that's going on as well. I wonder if you can, is there any connection between the crank and the philosophy, or way he was, or
I think he's a bit of a misanthrope. I mean, it comes out in that Eros passage at the end, and also the Mastropos passage where he teases him about being the best matchmaker. And yeah, it's obviously a definite reversal of what Antisthenes would claim for himself. So Xenophon, I think Xenophon disagrees with Antisthenes in that Xenophon's very social and very practical, and Antisthenes was not. He did his own solipsistic thing, and so maybe that's what the crankiness reflects. But I don't think he's a double. I think he is a good pupil of Socrates. I don't think he's a double. He does do things Socrates doesn't do at the symposium because we're supposed to have fun. But so does Hermogenes. I mean, Hermogenes also does things that Socrates doesn't do, like pointing out publicly that Protagoras has failed to learn, and that Callias is not listening or whatever, as the comment came this morning. That was great. So I think they're disciples, and I think they're inside disciples. So I think the passage in Memorabilia 2:5 about friendship in Francesca's paper, I think he is performing. He's not being refuted at all. I think he's helping. He's like a side actor with Socrates to act out this argument just for the audience. Whereas in 3:11 with Theodote, I think he's the audience, and the Theodote is helping Socrates act out just for the audience. And he and Apollodorus, Apollodorus is the one who cries all the time, and Antisthenes is the one who can't love anybody. They need to hear from Socrates and Theodote how these things can be done.
We have 4 minutes left.
Curious about the end of the symposium, because we don't really get a full account of who leaves and who stays. We know that it seems like all the men with wives leave, but there are also unmarried men who say that now they will marry after watching the performance and leave. And then there's Socrates and some of the others who join Callias and with Lycon and Autolycus. Which camp do you think that Antisthenes ends up in? I guess I'm inspired by what you said.
Thank you. I've always just focused on Lycon and Autolycus missing them when they leave too early.
Mm-hmm.
But Antisthenes would have to be in the camp of the unmarried man who's supposed to get married, but he never does, of course. Yeah. So, but he's just not noticed. Yeah. So I guess we have to make it up ourselves.
Right. So you think he leaves?
No, isn't it only the married men who leave, or do the
I think
ones?
they're unmarried men who swear that they will get married.
And they
go-
leave.
Also, I think they leave,
Uh-huh,
I guess
uh-huh.
it's not.
I've never imagined him leaving. I've
Okay.
imagined him staying to the end,
Thank
but always being unfriendly.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.